How are you, everyone, and welcome to Manifested e-learning platform. The subject is public finance and taxation. We've been going through the procurement in public entities. In our last lesson, we studied the functions of the Public Procurement Administrative Review Board. Today, our focus is on the tendering process and selection of suppliers in the public sector. The tendering process. Tendering process. That tells you that there are stages in the process of tendering. So in this lesson, we want to analyze the stages. And therefore, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the tendering process and selection of suppliers in the public sector. Now, before we get into the process or various stages in the tendering process, we may need to first of all understand the standard tender documents. Standard tender documents. Standard tender documents. What are the standard documents that are used in the tendering process? That's what we will first of all consider. Then we'll move on to the second aspect, which is registration of suppliers. Registration of suppliers. Because candidates, in the tendering process, we have the procuring entity, we have suppliers, and the tenderers. So we'll study the process of registering suppliers. Then number 3 is invitation. Invitation to tender. We are going to learn what happens when inviting tenders. Invitation to tender. Number 4 is the submission and receipt of tenders. We are going to analyze the process of submitting and receiving tenders. 5, opening of tenders. When tenders are received by the tendering committee, then what are the steps that needs to be undertaken in the process of opening the tenders? That we are going also to learn. Then number 6, the 6th aspect in the tendering process is responsiveness of tenders. We will look at responsiveness of tenders. Number 7, evaluation of tenders. Number 7 is the evaluation of tenders. Then we have post qualification. There is the post qualification stage, that is after tenders have been evaluated. We have the post qualification. Then we also have what we call the opinion, which is must be given by a profession. So we call it professional opinion. Professional opinion may be need to be sought. 10, recommendation. We have recommendation of tender awards. Then lastly, successful tender. All right, successful tender. So these are 11 processes that we're going to analyze in our today's lesson, such that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the tendering process. So let's first of all begin by looking at the standard tender documents. Standard tender documents. Now, the authority is required to issue what we call standard tender documents for procurement and asset disposal. And the documents must be in a format that is prescribed for use by the procuring entities. So a procuring entity is expected or required to use standard procurement and asset disposal documents prescribed in all procurement and asset disposal proceedings. All right? So these documents, one feature of the documents, number one, is standard tender documents, standard tender documents. One feature of these tender documents is that the documents used by a procuring entity should contain sufficient information. Contain sufficient information. These documents that are used in the tendering process should contain sufficient information to allow fair competition among those who may wish to submit tenders. And therefore, learners, for instance, if you are interested in obtaining a tender from the government or county government or any government department, you don't need to bother on the matter to do with documentation, how you are going to, which documents you're going to use to apply for the tender. You should seek for the standard tender documents from the procuring entity. And the information that you obtain from the procuring entity should contain sufficient, the documents should contain sufficient information. Another point to note under standard tender documents is that an accounting officer of a procuring entity is the one who is responsible for preparation of tender documents in consultation with the user and other relevant departments. Accounting officer is responsible for providing tender documents. It's not the one who applies for the tender. No, it is the accounting officer of the procuring entity that is responsible for providing tender documents. Part C is that the one applying for tender may be expected to pay a fee. Okay, the procuring entity may charge a fee for obtaining the standard tender documents. A procuring entity may charge a fee for obtaining tender documents as prescribed by regulations. And these are regulations that are developed by the Cabinet Secretary. And the fee has to be stated in the tender documents. So if you are to pay for tender documents, then you can countercheck the fee that is recommended. Someone don't need to charge you higher fees. Why? Because the fees is determined by the regulations which are developed by the Cabinet Secretary. Okay? And this fee should be stated in the tender documents. Then D, the tender documents should also specify requirements prepared. Okay? The standard, I'm saying the standard tender documents should specify the requirements prepared relating to the goods, relating to the services being procured, and the time limit for delivery or completion. The time limit. The tender documents should specify the time limits for delivery or completion. And if works are being procured, then relevant drawings and bills of quantities shall be disclosed, and the project's total estimated cost evaluated only on the basis of criteria disclosed. But a person shall not be disqualified on the basis that the bidder quoted above or below a certain percentage of engineers' estimates. So the standard tender documents I'm saying here, when it comes to works, if works are being procured, then there ought to be relevant drawings. These are relevant drawings by engineers. They are also to be ought to be estimated cost, relevant drawings. We have bills of quantities. Bills of quantities. We have estimated costs, and so on. Then the tender documents, candidates, should also specify the general conditions to which the contract will be subject, including any requirement that performance security will be provided before the contract is entered into. There also ought to be what we call the tender number. A tender number should be assigned. The document should contain a tender number assigned to the procurement proceedings by the procuring entity. By the procuring entity. So tender number assigned. Another point is the number of copies to be submitted with the original. How many copies should be submitted with the original? The document should also be clear. The number of copies to be submitted with the original tender, or any requirement that tender security be provided, and the form and the amount of any such security should also be specified. The procuring entity facilitation and the submission of tender documents by the tenderer through either soft, the copies could also be either may be required to be submitted in soft or could be submitted in hard copy. But it will be the onus of the tenderer to ensure the adequate submission of said documents. Another point is an explanation. The documents should explain, or an explanation of where and when tenders shall be submitted. There ought to be a statement that the tenders will be opened immediately after the deadline for submitting them, and an explanation of where the tenders will be opened. Where and when. That should be clear in the standard tender documents. Then there ought to be information within the documents as to the period during which tenders will remain valid. Period tenders will remain valid. What is the period? Is it after the tenders are made? Will it be 10 days? Is it 3 months? Or what is the period? That has to be stated within the tender documents, standard tender documents, the period. Procedure to be used in comparing tenders should also be clear. Proceedings. What proceedings? There ought to be a statement. All right? Or in regard to the proceedings, that the procedures, not proceedings, but procedures that will be used in comparing tenders. The procedures and criteria to be used to evaluate and compare tenders, that has to be clear. IJK, candidates, we are discussing the standard tender documents. What information is required within the documents before we move to the next step. And another point in relation to standard tender documents is that there ought to be provision for providing details of subcontractors. Details of subcontractors for the bidder. And where applicable, a declaration that subcontractors have complied with the Act. So this is important information as far as tender documents are concerned. We've said they should contain sufficient information. The accounting officer is responsible for providing tender documents. There ought to be a fee which is stated on the tender documents. There is also the question on the time limit. And in case of works, we've said that relevant drawings, bills of quantities, and estimated costs should be clear. A tender number should be assigned. The documents should have tender numbers. It also should be clear under standard tender documents the number of copies that the tenderer should submit with the original to the procuring entity. There is also the question on the explanation of where the tenders are to be submitted and when. There's also the period tenders will remain valid. That has to be clearly stated within the documents. Then there are also procedures to be used in comparing tenders, and there's a question on subcontractors. So these are standard tender documents. Let's now move on to registration of suppliers. Registration of suppliers. Registration of suppliers. Registration of suppliers. Now, candidates, the head of procurement function is required to maintain and continuously update list of registered suppliers, contractors, and consultants in various specific categories of goods, works, or services according to the procurement needs. So the head of procurement department, head of procurement department should continuously update list of suppliers. It's a continuous process. It's a continuous process. There's no end to having list of suppliers being updated. It ought to be updated. Updated list. Should update list or should have an updated list of registered suppliers, registered contractors, registered consultants in various what? Specific categories of goods, specific categories of works, specific categories of services, according to the procurement needs of a procuring entity. Then, if one would want to be a supplier to a procurement entity, then there ought to be no cost. In other words, an application to be included in the list of procuring entity may be made at any time. Application can be made at any time at no cost. At any time at no cost, and shall remain proof. It has to have what? It has to have proof. That application must have proof of eligibility criteria as prescribed in the Act. There has to be capability criteria. Do you understand? Two important things. When application is being made, when one is applying to be included as a supplier, then that can be done at any time, at no cost. And that application must contain proof that the potential supplier is eligible. And that the supplier has to be taken through what we call eligibility criteria, which is prescribed by Act. There is also capability criteria that defines necessary qualifications, experience, resource, equipment, and facilities to provide what is being procured. Another point, a tenderer may seek clarification. A tenderer may seek clarification from the candidate or relevant government agency on eligibility, but not on capability. On eligibility, but not capability. A tenderer may seek clarification from the government or from the procuring entity, and clarification should be limited to eligibility, but not capability. That is seeking clarification for registration for one to become a supplier. Point number 4 is that the lists shall be applied on the alternative procurement methods as specified and appropriate, and the list shall be generated through a portal. List generated through a portal. The list of registered suppliers generated through a portal can be generated through a website. It can be a portal, could be a website, and people submitting hard copies of the intention to supply. There could also be submission of hard copies. That means it can be done online. This is online, or it can be done physically, because hard copies are delivered physically. Do you understand? And finally, it can allow for continuous applications. Continuous applications. All right? Because we talked of no time. Application can be made at any time. So there ought to be continuous applications and updating. Continuous updating. Continuous application, continuous updating. And the list can be evaluated, leading to registration of a biannual or on biannual basis. So that is registration of suppliers. Registration of suppliers. Registration of suppliers. Then there is invitation to tender. The next stage is invitation to tender. Invitation to tender. Number 3, invitation to tender. Invitation to tender. Invitation to tender. Invitation to tender. Now, the accounting officer should ensure the preparation of an invitation to tender that sets out several things, like the name and address of the procuring entity, name and address of procuring entity, the name and address of procuring entity. That is one thing. The second important thing is the tender number. Tender number. This is the tender number that is assigned to the procuring to the procurement proceedings by the procuring entity. Then there ought to be brief description of works. Brief description of the goods, the works or services being services, goods being procured. A brief description of works, services, and goods being procured description. And that should include the limit, the time limit for delivery or completion. D, tender documents. Tender documents. There ought to be an explanation of how to obtain the tender documents, including the amount of any fee, if any. So we are talking about invitation to tender, and I'm explaining what the accounting officer should ensure or should set out. Because like tender documents, the tenderers may not know where to get the documents. So the accounting officer should provide a brief description of the documents that are to be used in the tendering process. Where are the documents to be found, and what is the fee to be paid for obtaining such documents. When a brief description of when and where the documents are to be submitted. Where the tenders shall be submitted, there ought to be an explanation of where and when tenders shall be submitted, and where and when the tenders shall be opened. Submitted and also opened. When will they be submitted? When will the tenders be submitted? Where will the tenders be submitted? When will the tenders be opened? Where will the tenders be opened? Where and when? Where and when? Another point in invitation to tender, important one, is a statement that those submitting tenders or their representatives may attend opening of tenders. Attending opening of tenders. There ought to be a statement that is generated by an accounting officer setting out details on attending and opening of tenders. A statement that those submitting tenders or their representatives may attend the opening of tenders. EFG, this is now in relation to preferences and reservations. Preferences and reservations. There could be applicable preferences and reservations pursuant to the Act. So the accounting officer of the procuring entity should set out the preferences and reservations. H is a declaration that the tender is only open to those who meet the requirements for eligibility. All right? the tender, there ought to be a declaration by the accounting officer that the tender is only open to those who meet the requirements for eligibility. Do you understand? A declaration. When inviting tenders, the accounting officer should declare that the tender is only open to those who meet the requirements for eligibility. That's why you hear sometimes those who do not meet eligibility ought not apply. Those who do not meet eligibility do not need to apply. Then there is a requirement on serialization of pages. When submitting tenders, the accounting officer should make it clear that there be serialization of pages by the bidder for each bid submitted. Then there's a point on FGHIJ. Is an important point on recorded delivery. Recorded what? Delivery. All tender documents are to be sent out to eligible bidders by recorded delivery. All tender documents after the tenderers have applied for the tenders and the documents are to be delivered, then that delivery has to be recorded. All tender documents are sent out to eligible bidders by recorded delivery as evidence of having received the tender document. So, invitation to tender, these are important points that the accounting officer should take note of and should ensure when preparing, when in the process of preparing or in the preparation of an invitation to tender. These should be put in place. And you see we've ended up with a point on recorded delivery. After all these have been done and the tender documents ought to be sent out to the eligible bidders, then that has to be done through recorded delivery. So that is invitation to tender. The fourth step is submission and receipt of tenders. Submission and receipt of tenders. Here, remember candidates, we've ended with the delivery of tender documents to the eligible bidders. Here, we now moving on to the point on submission and receipt of tenders. Submission and receipt of tenders. Submission and receipt of tenders. After receiving the tender documents, the tenderers are required to submit, and the procuring entity is expected to receive the tenders. So submission of tender documents, whether in electronic or manual form, must be done in writing. A very important point. One, submission of tender documents should be in writing. Whether they are being submitted electronically or in a manual form, they must be submitted in writing. The documents should be signed, and in the case of manual submission, they should be sealed in an envelope, okay? And sealed in an envelope, that is if they are being submitted manually. Submission of tender documents should be in writing, should be signed and sealed in an envelope. That is if the documents are to be delivered manually. Number 2 is a point on tender number. Tender number should be assigned. Tender number should be assigned. A tender document and envelope in which it is sealed in should bear the tender number assigned to the procurement or asset disposal proceedings by the procuring entity. By the procuring entity. Do you understand? Then there is a point on submission before deadline. Submission what? Before deadline. A tender shall be submitted before the deadline for submitting tenders. And any tender submitted after the deadline shall not be accepted by the procuring entity. So if the deadline is, say, on 30th September, that means that all tenders should be received by 29th of September. So tenders must be submitted before the deadline. Any tender submitted after the deadline cannot be accepted by the procuring entity. We are discussing submission of tenders. Another point is in relation to the place. Place. The procuring entity should ensure that the place or site where tenders are submitted is open. The place should be open. The place for submitting tenders should be opened by the procuring entity. And it should not just be open, it should be open and accessible. And the procuring entity should provide in that place or site a tender box. Because these are documents being submitted. So the place should be opened and accessible. And in that place, there ought to be a tender box, including an electronic tender box that complies with the prescribed requirements in regulations. That should be clear. Candidates submitting tenders, documents, they must be submitted in a place. If it is a building, then the doors must be opened. Now, when the tenderers walk in, then they have to put the documents, tender documents somewhere. And where is the place? There ought to be a box. That's what the law says. There ought to be a box where the tenders are submitted. You understand? Number 5 is a point on unopened places. Each tender that is delivered shall be placed unopened in the tender box. 5, each tender that is delivered should be placed unopened in the tender box. Each tender that is delivered should be placed unopened in the tender box if one, the tender is delivered by post or by the staff of the procuring entity immediately upon receipt. So are you following, candidates? We are discussing submission of tenders. I want you to see the process. We are studying the tendering process. And before we came to submission and receipt of tenders, we had discussed invitation to tender, where tenderers were invited. We've gone through the invitation to tender procedure. The invitation to tender procedure, and the last step here is the recorded delivery. This is where the tenderer has applied for tender is now being sent the tender documents, and we say that when tender documents are being delivered to the tenderer, they ought to be recorded. That process ought to be recorded, and that's the ending step in the invitation to tender. Then when we come to submission, which we are now discussing, submission of tenders, it's also a process. It is a process. We say that the submission of tenders, tender documents should be in writing. The submission should be in writing. That is step number one. It should be signed and the envelope sealed. We also say that the tenders should be numbered, should be assigned a tender number. Then submissions of tenders must be made before the deadline. All right? The procuring entity, we've said in point number 4, should state the place where the tenders are to be submitted. That place should be opened, should be accessible. And in that place, there ought to be a tender box. Are you seeing the process? There ought to be a tender box. Now we are on point number 8, where we're saying, point number 5, where I'm saying that each tender should be placed unopened in the tender box. Each tender that is delivered should be placed unopened in the tender box. All right? Should be opened and should be unopened. The tender should be unopened in the tender box if A, the tender is delivered by post by the staff of the procuring entity immediately upon receipt. If the tender is delivered by post, that's, for example, you are placing a tender and you are sending by post to a procuring entity, then it means that an employee or a staff of the procuring entity should or is expected to go and collect the mail from the post office. That means that the tenderer is not delivering himself or herself to the procuring entity, but is sending by post, which then means that the staff of the procuring entity should go to the post office and collect the mail. So, if the tender is delivered by post, then the staff of the procuring entity immediately upon delivery should be placed on, the tender should be placed unopened in the tender box. And if the tender is delivered otherwise than by post, by the person delivering the tender, then again it should be placed unopposed in the tender box. That should be clear. Then we are moving on to point number 6, still under submission and receipt of tenders. If a tender that is delivered by post is inadvertently opened, that inadvertently opened means it's opened unintentionally. If it is opened unintentionally, then the fact of that opening should be recorded on the envelope by the person who opened the tender, and that tender shall be placed in the tender box. Because candidates, it happens. Sometimes you may open the envelope accidentally, unintentionally, inadvertently. Then if that happens, then the one who opens it unintentionally, then it should write of that fact on the envelope and then place it in the tender box. Number 7, if a tender or part of a tender cannot fit into the tender box, if it cannot fit in the tender box, then what should happen? Because we say that the envelope must be placed in a tender box. But what if the envelope does not fit in the tender box? What should happen? If a tender or part of a tender cannot fit in the tender box, it should be received in the manner set out in the tender documents or in the invitation to tender. Or if no such manner is set out, in the manner determined by the procuring entity, and the procuring entity should acknowledge receipt of the tender documents. So there ought to be guidelines on how an envelope should be received. That is where the envelope does not fit in a tender box. That is, if a tender or part of a tender cannot fit into a tender box, it should be received in the manner set out in the tender documents. So the tender documents, these documents. That's why we began discussing tender documents. That information should be available in the tender documents. If not in the tender documents, then it should be made available. That information should be made available in the invitation to tender documents. All right? That is submission and receipt. We've discussed how submission is to be made. We've discussed how the procuring entity should do what? Should receive the tenders. Now, after receiving the tenders, then the next obvious step in the tendering process is the opening of tenders. The tenders are now inside the box. We've gone through all the procedures on how the envelopes should be placed in the box. Now that the envelopes are placed in the box, the tender box, then we move to the opening of tenders. What are the processes, the procedure?